started in business, Mr. Warner?
Well, my choice of careers was very scientific. It's kind of like the bus stopped on that corner. And I went to work for First National Exchange Bank and had a W-2 form from that single corporation every year in succession for 44 years. I first started there when I was in high school, at Jefferson High School, just across the street, and worked as a messenger boy. They called me a runner. That's why I took the job, because I liked the title. I was really more of a stroller, but they called me a runner, so I took that job and worked in the afternoons, and in the morning I would pick up the mail at 6 a.m. at the post office, and then in the afternoon pick it up and get it stamped and sealed and take it back to the post office at 6 p.m. at the end of the day. And I could do that during the summer months and during Christmas vacation and all of that. So I worked at the bank, then FNEB, First National Exchange Bank, for the first 2 years I was at Roanoke College. And then I transferred to UVA for my third year, and could still come back when all my rich fraternity brothers were going to Bermuda during spring break. I would come back to work at the bank. I didn't have any money, so that helped pay for my college. And then just before I graduated from UVA, I got a letter from the chief executive, Mr. Francis Koch, who had helped me get some scholarship money and some loan money to transfer to UVA, and offered me a job when I graduated. And so I just came right back there because I needed a job. I had a car with a car payment. I was thinking about getting married. I was going to have an apartment, so it was pretty lucky. My first job there was as the bank's collection man. I only had one, and I was it. So I spent all day long calling people, giving them trouble about being late with their car payment or their television payment or their installment loan. I've actually stolen more cars than I've ever owned in my lifetime, because back in those days, before we had all the consumer protection laws, if the guy was 90 days past due on his car and wouldn't surrender the key voluntarily, a guy named Henry Woolwine and I would go out in the dark of the night, hook it up and tow it away. So I've actually stolen a lot of cars. And then went into other kinds of work at the bank. I guess the first really meaningful job was as the bank's correspondent bank officer. Correspondent banks were small banks in Western Virginia, Southern West Virginia, East Tennessee, Northern North Carolina, who did business with us, in other words, kept deposits with us in exchange for our performing services for them, because we were the largest bank in the region, performing services for them that they couldn't get as easily or as inexpensively as they could from us. My job was to persuade them to keep more money with us in exchange for more services. So I was kind of a traveling salesman. I had, when I took the job, we had about 85 banks doing business with us. When I finished 9 years later, we had 122 banks. And when I started out, we had about $15 million in deposits. And when I ended, we had $40 million in deposits. Free money, non-interest bearing deposits. So with $40 million, you could make a lot of money. So I'm rambling a little bit here, but
how'd you get into the marketing?
I was about to go to that. I was never really much of a technical banker. I always had a persuasive capability, so I was one-on-one attracting customers for a large part of my career. One of the best jobs I ever had was as the bank's national account officer. And I would travel to New York and Chicago and Atlanta and Philadelphia. I guess we had a couple of accounts in California. And my job was to get those large corporations either to keep more money with us or borrow more money from us, rather than some other bank. And so I was making sales calls, and was pretty successful at that. I was the guy in the bank that persuaded National Bank AmeriCard to let us have the second Bank AmeriCard franchise in Virginia. They only wanted to do one in a state, and First and Merchants already had one in Richmond. And I persuaded the guy that ran Bank AmeriCard, a guy named Don McBride, got him on the golf course and persuaded him that we were so far away from Richmond that it was like a separate market altogether. And he said, if you can persuade the president of First and Merchants that that's true, then we'll let you have one. So I called my boss and I said, you need to call whoever the president was, I can't remember his name now, and ask him, tell him that we've been offered a Bank AmeriCard franchise if he doesn't object. They were good personal friends, and we were a long way from Richmond. They didn't have a bank out here, so we weren't really going to compete with them in a direct way, so we got that franchise. So I built a reputation in the company of being able to sell. And because bankers don't think in terribly deep terms, they thought, okay, he can sell, he must know something about marketing. So we decided to create a marketing department, and I was given the job of running that. You know, because you're in the business, that marketing is a lot more than just advertising. And our stereotypical view of marketing was that you just run a few ads. And it was my job to persuade my bosses and the management of the bank that marketing was much more than that. That if we were going to be effective, we needed to do the marketing research. We needed to have focus groups. We needed to find out how we were being perceived in the marketplace, how were our products being viewed, how could we modify those to make them more convenient or more profitable or better accepted, and then start advertising, and then do sales training, and put together a real comprehensive marketing department. For heaven's sakes, to actually draw up, to write a marketing plan, certainly on an annual basis, and we tried to do a 3-year marketing plan so we'd have some continuity. We developed graphic manuals so that all of our banks would be consistent in the way they used our logos and our branding. And branding was something they'd never thought of. When I became the chief executive officer, I expanded that marketing background to try and create a total marketing engine for the whole corporation. In other words, everything we did was focused on selling our products, improving our profitability, and improving our reputation, which would make us able to sell more products. So we did things like encourage our people to be part of community activities, United Way, and all those kinds of community support groups, and make it known, be sure that our customers and the community knew that we were deeply invested in the community and deeply involved in the community, and a generous donor to things that made the community a better place to live. So we were perceived as something different than just an ordinary bank. Our view was that we were the keepers of the community's available cash reserves. And as such, we had a responsibility to see that those reserves were put to work in a constructive and productive way to make the community grow, to create jobs, and to make Roanoke and Roanoke Valley a better place to live in terms of quality of life.
I have to ask, that sounds like around what time was that, and was that a fairly unusual global view?
It was very unusual in banking.
If you want that, you have to take it again because you were still talking.
Let's just start again because we kind of overlap, but just so you know, what the steps FNEB took were very unusual in banking, and go from there.
Well, the concept of making the whole corporation a marketing engine was unheard of, and not common in banking at all. It's one of the reasons I guess I won that award as Marketing Executive of the Year in 1974, because other people in other parts of the state realized that we were doing things that hadn't been done before. We did things early. For example, we started a management training school, and I personally recruited 2 or 3 women to be in the management training school. My male commercial lending officers were aghast that we were going to have women in the management training school. Who ever heard of women in management? But you may have heard the names of Susan Still, who now runs Hometown Bank, and Carol Jarrett, who was marketing director for First Union for the state of Virginia. Both of them were the 2 first women to go to Dominion's management training school. We started a child care center in our operations center over on Plantation Road with deeply discounted rates for the parents of children so they could keep them on site. And again, my conservative banking officers just about flipped. And some of the unmarried male employees want to know, why do the women get those kinds of benefits and we don't? I said, well, when you have a baby and you want us to keep it, you'll get that benefit. But our productivity went up, our absenteeism went down, our morale was greatly improved, and we got national publicity for that, all of which enhanced our image and reputation in the local community. And people thought of us as something greater than just a receiver of deposits and a maker of loans.
I remember an ad, and I don't have any idea who did it. It may have been associated, it may have been after Dale Poindexter took it over, about you guys talking about how you would put baby oil on lenses of your tellers, of your glasses, so that they would experience what it was like to be older and have diminished vision and trying to work on things.
I'm not aware of that. I wouldn't put it past us, but I'm not aware of that. I don't remember that.
To me. Let's see here. How important do you think marketing and advertising was in the transitioning of F&EB into Dominion and into really not just for the bank, but there was a time where Roanoke became known as the banking center of Western Virginia, and clearly that coincided with F&EB's ascension. How important was the marketing piece to that?
Well, it was essential. It was a central part of it.
Can I just say the marketing piece was an essential part of the growth?
The marketing concept of Dominion was essential to that transition. You remember I told you that one of my early jobs was as a correspondent bank officer calling on smaller country banks throughout Western Virginia. Well, we bought most of those banks, or eventually. Well, that's an overstatement. We usually bought the largest bank in a given community. There was almost always more than one. But because I had familiarity with that management and with a lot of those board members, I could get my boss an audience with those decision makers, and we ended up buying 57 banks over a period of about 5 or 6 years. So we became the largest bank west of Richmond, and clearly the largest bank in this area. The first bank we bought was a bank in Bedford. Then we bought a second bank in Bedford. So we bought both Citizens Bank and First National in Bedford, and then we went on and had banks in Tazewell and in Wytheville and in Marion and in Bristol, and finally in Maryland and the District of Columbia. And we bought Metropolitan National Bank in Richmond, and we bought the First National Bank in Norfolk, and folded all of those into the then Dominion brand. My boss at that time, Bill Scherer, and I were flying to Richmond after we had bought Metropolitan and decided we needed to have one name for all of these banks instead of a lot of names, so we could actually have a cohesive branding operation. And we decided just out of the blue that Dominion was a good name because it identified us clearly as a Virginia corporation in Virginia. But we learned later that outside of Virginia, it wasn't a hindrance to us. They didn't necessarily define us as Virginians. So It worked beautifully. And yes, marketing, consistency, branding was an essential part of that successful transition.
It's changed so much. I remember I've been talking to Dale Poindexter and several others, and the consolidation of banks. I'm sure it's had a big effect on the world. But from my little part of the world, from the advertising agency, used to, if you hung out a shingle, a bank was one of the first things you got a bank and you got a car dealer. It was almost your innate right for opening an ad agency because there were so many of them. And when when it associated, we lost Dominion. We got First Federal. You just went across the road, and that was how it worked. And there was Colonial America, and then any number of them. And it's just it isn't that way anymore.
Well, as long as I had anything to do with marketing, after I went into management, I tried not to get in the way of the people who were responsible for marketing, like a guy named Earl McGuire that I brought into Roanoke to run marketing for a while. So I didn't try to influence where they did what agencies they used. But as long as I had anything to do with it, we were clearly committed to Associated Advertising, run by John Will Creasy, one of the most creative guys I ever knew, and a nice guy and a smart guy. And his partner, Fred Christofny, known also as Freddie Lee, who ran an orchestra that played at the Greenbrier and at a lot of dances at Hotel Roanoke. But they were quite an effective team, and they had a good creative staff, good artists on their staff, and they knew the market. So they did a very good job for us.
How did your work in marketing, and probably more even, how did your work in marketing prepare you for when I got here, which was in the mid-'80s, you were clearly the most prominent executive in the region. Arguably, you're one of the more prominent executives ever around here, not just for your work at Dominion, but also for your work in the community. How did your work in marketing prepare you for the role you took on?
I don't think it did. The management job is a dramatically different job than just marketing. But I must say, I think a degree of my success in management, which is largely managing people and managing strategic thinkers and protecting the assets of the corporation, I think my background in persuasive activities and in the discipline that marketing forces on a marketing budget was helpful and gave me a different perspective than I would have had if my only background was analyzing financial statements and approving loan applications.
What local advertising campaigns do you remember that you thought were particularly interesting or effective?
I think one of the most effective advertising campaigns or marketing strategies I've ever known about was one done by Bill Davis, known around town as Dr. Pepper Davis, in the 1940s when he was running the Dr. Pepper Bottling Company here in Roanoke. It was pure magic. Davis was an inveterate salesman and a very clever guy, was eventually on the board of First National Exchange Bank and Dominion. But listen to what he did. In the 40s, Roanoke, Virginia was the only place in America where Dr. Pepper outsold Coca-Cola. And here's how he did it. One of the ways he did it. He not only had billboards all over the place selling Dr. Pepper, that big sign on top of the Shenandoah Hotel is a Bill Davis product, 10, 2, and 4. The idea was to have a Dr. Pepper 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 4 p.m. If you had 3 Dr. Peppers a day, he'd be a rich man, and he did get to be a rich man. But he had a radio show on WDBJ radio when WDBJ radio was down on Kirk Avenue. And a guy named Irving Sharp on Saturday morning played the Dr. Pepper Silver Dollar Man. And he would talk about Dr. Pepper, but in the community, he would have a guy knocking on doors at random And the lady of the house would come to the door and he'd say, "Show me how many Dr. Peppers you have in your refrigerator, already cold and ready to be used." And for every Dr. Pepper she had in the refrigerator, she'd get a silver dollar. For all my childhood years, we had 2 cartons, 12 bottles of Dr. Pepper in our refrigerator. Dr. Pepper Silver Dollar Man never knocked on our door, but think how many houses in Roanoke had 2 or 3 cartons of Dr. Pepper in the refrigerator waiting for the Silver Dollar Man to come along. Every time my father would take one out of the fridge, my mother would say, "Jeff, be sure you replace that Dr. Pepper. If the Dr. Pepper Silver Dollar Man comes, I want to get $12. And it worked.
Oh, that's a great story. Yeah.
Now, that was radio advertising and a great gimmick, but it was, I think, one of the most creative and effective. Must have been effective. We were the only place in America where we were outselling Coca-Cola during the war, when Coca-Cola was about the only soft drink anybody knew about, at least the military.
I heard that they actually took, I think it was Irv Sharp, I heard they actually took some of his stuff national. That some of the Dr. Pepper advertising and marketing that was done here in Roanoke became like blueprints for the national.
Yeah, they took a lot of Bill Davis's advertising ideas and took them to Texas, where Dr. Pepper was headquartered, and used them on a national basis. You're right.
We want that same big truck roll by.
Yeah. Can you take that again? Then we had a big truck roll by, and it got a little bit of the sound that they took a lot of.
Oh yeah, they took a lot of Bill Davis's advertising ideas and marketing strategies, and adopted them in Texas. I think it's Dallas, Texas, where Dr. Pepper was headquartered, and put them on a national basis. Yeah, they sure did. And Davis was on the Dr. Pepper board, the national board, for a while.
We had so many cola places. When we first started redoing this building, I said, there's a cola heritage to Roanoke that's fascinating. I mean, they had 7, 8 bottling plants going at the same time. Of course, this was a double cola. They had the Coca-Cola, the Pepsi. They had the Dr. Pepper. There was a lot of them going on.
Well, and Mountain Dew was created in Marion.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. Hey, well, tell me about your marketing executive of the year award and how did you get nominated for that? What was it like to win?
I think I don't know, because I just got a phone call and said, "Oh, we want you to come to Richmond. We're going to have a dinner and want to award you make this award to you." I think my staff at Dominion, or must have, I guess it was early on, nominated me for that award. It was an advertising association of some sort, or a marketing association headquartered in Richmond, and that's how I got it. It was a surprise to me, but I was very pleased, of course.
Did you have any regrets or reservations about leaving the marketing department to become more of an executive at the bank?
No, because I needed the money. I had a pretty good salary as head of marketing, but nothing like the opportunity to accumulate wealth through stock options and I guess I was making 3 or 4 times as much money as chief executive and chairman as I was as head of marketing. But although this may sound a little self-flattering, I don't really mean it to. It's just a fact. Not many marketing officers become chief executives in banks, because banks and bankers tend to think that credit experience is more important than any other experience in bank management. I was out to prove that wrong, and I, at least as one witness, would declare that is wrong, and I think Dominion proved it.
Why do you think it's important to have a strong marketing, advertising, and communications community of people who in a city like Roanoke, a creative community, let's say? And it doesn't always happen. Why is it important to have a creative community and out-of-the-box type of thinkers in a community the size of Roanoke, and how do we benefit as a community?
Well, marketing and advertising, the whole idea of merchandising products or services is dependent on people knowing what those services are, how much they cost, what their benefits are, what their weaknesses and strengths are. Advertising and marketing is an educational tool. So we have a lot of manufacturers around here. We have a lot of retailers. We have a lot of service organizations. The purchasers of those services and goods wouldn't know about that if there weren't means to learn about it. The educational aspect of advertising and marketing, I think, is essential. Now, of course, we have a lot more media than we used to. Excuse me. The social media add a wide dimension of educational tools. Used to be just radio and television and other and newspapers and magazines. That's quaint thinking by today's standards, but it's the same idea. It's educational, it's information. And Roanoke has always had, for whatever reason, a very strong and unusually diverse creative community for advertising and marketing. Too bad for you because you're in the business, which means you've got a lot of competition. But Access is doing well, and so is everybody else.
I remember when I moved here, the modus operandi was if you bought WDBJ, 3 radio stations, maybe put up a billboard, you had everybody. You had everybody in Roanoke, running Roanoke Times ad here and there. That was what a media buyer's plan was. Okay, let's do a Roanoke Times ad, two or three radio stations, and 1 TV station. You'll be fine.
I'm aware of an unusual media strategy now being used in Roanoke by Fink's Jewelers. Mark Fink doesn't use newspapers very much at all. He's got billboards strategically located around the community. They're very well placed, and they're very professionally done. And that's his principal advertising, just billboards.
He's certainly sold a lot of jewelry over the years. That's pretty hard to argue with. You've worked on pretty much anything that's been important in the last number of years. We won't even say how many. As far as community service, certainly Jefferson High School stands out. But how can advertising and marketing help in the role of revitalizing Jefferson or the Hotel Roanoke or the 611, which is getting revitalized?
Well, you know perhaps better than I do that advertising is a support instrument. It's educational. And all those public projects, starting way back, I guess, with Center in the Square, and then I guess even before that, the reopening of Hotel Roanoke, and then the conversion of the Shenandoah Hotel, and then the creation of the Higher Education Center, and then the creation of Jefferson Center out of this old high school. A lot of things like that. They were all fundamentally capital campaigns, fundraising campaigns. So people don't perform the illogical, counterintuitive act of giving away after-tax dollars unless they're emotionally involved. So the advertising, the media contact and the direct mail contact that we used to inform people about what was happening, why it was beneficial, what improvements it was going to make for the community in developing better quality of life, and why it was important to have such a facility as the Higher Education Center or Center in the Square or the Jefferson Center. We used all of those marketing strategies to inform people so that then we could go out and do the plain hard work of asking for a contribution.
You've answered pretty much all my questions. I guess if I could, I would love to get one more, just your thoughts on John Will Creasy, working with him on both as a client relationship, and also I know you guys work together on many things, like probably getting the D-Day Foundation started, and certainly Center in the Square and whatnot.
John Will, the Sidewalk Art Show that is now such a big hit, sponsored by the Taubman Museum now, was a creation of John Will Creasy. It started on Kirk Avenue between Jefferson Street and First Street, just that one block. And it was Jack's idea, and he talked other artists into joining that effort. And I remember First National Exchange Bank made a contribution, a cash contribution, to help support the logistics of that. He was very creative, very community-minded. He was a really nice guy, had a great sense of humor. I loved to spend time with him. He was also one of the guys that thought of the idea of the Chamber of Commerce sponsoring trips to other countries. And he and Adelaide would be on almost all those trips, and I would too. And even with her disability, they would crawling on and off those buses and getting on those airplanes. He just had a thirst for knowledge and a intellectual curiosity about the world, the people in the world, and all the different ways that make the world work, that made him endlessly fascinating as not only as a business colleague, but as a friend.
That's great. Okay, my last question. This is very important. Do you still drink Dr. Pepper?
I hardly ever drink Dr. Pepper. I'm more of a Beefeater guy.
That's great. Hey, I need to get a camera and grab a quick picture of you, and I wouldn't mind getting one of you and Leonard that I put on Access's Facebook. Just take me a second.